Hey y'all, my hand tool collection is growing, but I don't have anywhere to store them, so today we're going to build a tool chest. We're going to build the main structure out of pine as prices are finally dropping on it, and we're going to use this project to practice hand cutting box joints, as well as some other chisel work. My largest saw is 24 inches long, so we're making the inside dimensions 25 inches wide by 15 inches tall by only 7 inches deep. Part of the reason for this small awkward footprint is that I do have to carry this outside every time I want to work on a project, so it needs to be portable, and it needs to be able to sit on top of my workbench without taking up too much space. After cutting out the top, bottom, and sides, I start the box joint layout process by marking the depth of my joints, then tracing that line in pencil to make it easier to see. I then lay out where my joints are going to be, making sure they're all evenly spaced so they'll look appealing when done. I flipped over the board and marked the back to make sure I have a reference on that side too, so I don't cut too deep. And lastly, once in the vise, I mark the tops to complete the layout. My first two cuts didn't end up great. They varied from the line a little bit, but what I learned was I was holding the saw too horizontal. And so on the third cut, I kept the saw at a 45-degree angle, focusing on my top and side line as long as I could, and then slowly rotated it horizontal, and I had a much easier time following the lines. As you can see here from the last few cuts on the board, you can barely even see the pencil marks. I then went through and cut the center line through each of the throwaway pieces to help make the clean out easier. Now to start the clean out, on the first section, I tried using just the chisel and mallet to knock out the debris. After getting halfway through the first side, I flipped the board over and used the same method to knock out the back. This took a long time, so attempting to speed up the process for the second section, I used the pole saw to cut away more of the material, hoping that would speed up the process. Going back to the chisel to finish it up, it came out just as clean, but it was still very time consuming. For the third section, I decided to break out the coping saw, another tool I inherited from my grandfather and am definitely not proficient in. But it really made quick work of cleaning out the excess and made the chisel work much easier, getting just as good a result. For the rest of the boards, what I ended up doing was using the pole saw to make an initial removal, then cleaning up with the coping saw, and then finishing the cuts with the chisel. Once I got all the fingers done on the top and bottom, I then started on the sides. I marched each side to make sure they would stay paired up, and then used a done board to be the guide for the side piece. After repeating the process, the main box was ready to be test fit. Being my first big box joint project, I think the joints came out pretty well. They aren't necessarily as tight as maybe I'd want them to be, but there weren't any significant gaps on any of the corners or sides. Before we're gluing, I need to cut the top of the board in half, as this will be part of the hinge top assembly later in the build. You can see here how it will eventually fold up on top. Now for the glue up, including gluing in both of the top pieces. I used all my clamps and then I checked for square. Now to build the back of the box, my thought was to build a panel and insert it into the back using the box joints as well. I glued up the panels to get a good fit, but math is hard sometimes, so I ended up having to go back and add a fourth panel later. I then cleaned up the panel with my jack plane to get a nice smooth surface, and then traced the back of the box onto it and started the cutout process. This cutting out of the back of the box did not go nearly as smoothly as I hoped for, and it needed a lot of reworks and touch-ups as it continually didn't fit each time I tried. I kept marking areas that seemed to be in the way and kept chiseling away at them until it would fit. Once it did fit, I glued it in place and clamped it overnight. You can see here a few gaps in the sides. This will definitely not be a method I'll be doing again of putting it back into the box, but we'll fix a lot of this here shortly. After cutting all the excess fingers and giving the piece a light sanding, I cut open the lid piece again, this time down the sides, leaving the box joints glued in place. Test fitting the flip up lid by folding up one piece, it left a larger bottom section to close out the front of the chest than I wanted. So I trimmed it down and needed to add the rest to the lid. After smoothing out the cut, I glued the bottom of the front to the box and assembled and glued the flip up part of the front. Again, smoothing the piece out after glue up, you can see here the initial fit's pretty good. Now for the hinges. I marked out my placement on the lid and box and ended up doing all the carve out with the chisel, making sure to keep the edges straight and clean as possible. Even with that, blowout happens sometimes, but nothing some glue and clamps overnight can't fix. Now with the rough assembly done, I cleaned up the edges with scraps and glue and sawdust. Anything with a big gap got a piece of scrap in it first, and then I filled the rest with the glue and sawdust mixture. After drying and a quick cleanup, the piece turned out presentable with most of the big issues in the back, luckily. After a thorough sanding, it was time to start assembling, including adding the hinges. Pilot holes and hand screwing the screws to make sure they didn't strip ended up working out great. You can see a bit of a gap when it folds down, but we're going to fix that with some trim. Rockler had a bunch of this Padauk in the scrap bin on sale, so we're going to use that for the details for the tool chest. To start, we need handles. I went ahead and cut a 45-degree piece out of the bottom of this to make a comfortable handle, but I wanted to add a little bit more flair, so I cut each side at 45 degrees as well. After marking and pre-drilling the sides, I glued on the handle, then pre-drilled and countersunk the screws into the back of the piece. After doing that on the other side, I also added one to the lid for easy access. Now where the lid meets the bottom, I glued on this ribbon of Padauk, letting it dry overnight, then came back with a flush cut saw and a jack plane to even out the piece. After a quick sanding, the piece is still not done. I had to do several passes with the jack plane on the bottom of the fold down lid to get it just right so it would close right in place. I used tung oil to finish this piece. It helps bring out some of the grain in the pine to make it look more interesting and will protect it overall. After a coat inside and out, I built a few holders for some of the tools and hung them by pre-drilling and hand tightening the screws in so they won't chance punching out the back, and also I can move them at any time as I need to change or add new holders. After a coat of tung oil on the holders, the chisels went in and can't fall out without being lifted up. I made this holder for my coping saw. For my pole saws, I tried a few different holders and all of them work well. And yes, I can close the lid and reopen it with the saws not falling out. I then added the rest of my hand tools. Once I use the tool chest for a while, I'll probably make more tool-specific holders, and I've got plenty of room for it and more tools as my collection grows. Well, that wraps up this build. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next project. Thanks!